All right, 7 o'clock. All right, welcome everybody. My name is Leanne Reynolds. I'm the Director of Conservation, or no, I'm not the Director of Conservation. Maybe I want to be, but I'm the Director of Education at the Squam Lakes Association. Thanks for joining us tonight. Once a month, on a Wednesday evening, we have our Squam Speaker Series. So before I turn it over to Micah from Native Plant Trust, I just want to give you a little heads up about our next series. So it's called Squam Speaker Series Where They Are Now. And we're going to have 3 former either Lakes Region Conservation Corps members or former Squam conservation interns sharing what they're doing now. So it'll be an interesting view into how folks are using the skills and experiences that they gain here at the SLA into their future. So you can find information about that on our website. And I will go ahead and turn it over to Micah.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Leanne. So good evening, everyone. My name is Micah Jasny. I'm the Botanical Coordinator with Native Plant Trust, formerly the New England Wildflower Society. We are actually the first plant organization in the nation focused solely on the conservation of plant species. And today I'm going to be presenting on the making and future of the Plant Conservation Volunteer Program, our organization's Rare Plant Regional Community Science Program. I do have time at the end of the presentation for questions. However, since we are a smaller group, if you have any questions at any point, feel free to type them into the chat or just unmute yourself and ask away. All right. Okay. So to understand the need for a community science conservation program, we need to first start by asking, why do we protect plants and what is the need for a regional plant conservation ethic? So let's look at the status of plants currently in New England. Over 22% of New England's native plants are either rare or deemed historic. Of the roughly 540 documented rare or historic species in New England, 62 species are globally rare, 25 are regionally rare, and 7 are endemic to New England and found nowhere else in the world. On average, these rare species have lost roughly 67% of their known range in the region over the last few decades. There's also a serious need to protect native plants from the constant threat of invasive species. Invasive species are currently considered the second biggest contributor to native species decline, surpassed only by habitat loss. In fact, 31% of the documented 3,514 plants in New England are non-native, and 10% of those are considered invasive and directly threaten native species. By protecting rare plants, we end up conserving the entire ecosystem, including countless other species. Each species lost will put more stress on their ecosystem and may result in the loss of additional species, which can eventually lead to ecosystem collapse. Plants truly serve as the canary in the coal mine. Their decline indicate other changes, such as loss of pollinators, and will have further ramifications for their ecosystems and the organisms that depend on them to survive, humans included. To help protect native species, the Nature Conservancy began partnering with states to create natural heritage programs starting in 1974. The goal of these programs is to assist federal efforts to protect and conserve plants, animals, and natural communities at a state level. Massachusetts became the first state in New England to formally establish a natural heritage program in 1978 when they created Mass Wildlife's Natural Heritage and Endangered Species Program. This was followed in 1984 when the Vermont chapter of the Nature Conservancy established the Vermont Natural Heritage Inventory and transferred it over to the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. CT Deep, the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, founded the Recreation and Natural Heritage Trust Program in 1986. This was followed in 1987 when the New Hampshire Division of Forest and Lands formed the New Hampshire Natural Heritage Bureau. These were finally followed by the creation of the Rhode Island Natural History Survey in 1994 and the Maine Natural Areas Program, or MNAP, in 1999. Despite the efforts of these programs, Native Plant Trust recognized a serious lack of regional scale monitoring and management of rare plant species in New England. At the highest levels, the federal government is generally solely focused on the emergency rescue of critically endangered species at the national level and not focused on regionally or locally rare species. While state governments and natural heritage programs do focus on locally rare species, they are primarily concerned with species that occur within their own jurisdictional boundaries and often do not communicate with other states. Also, natural heritage programs use widely varying criteria to determine whether a species should be classified as endangered or rare, and have varying degrees of concern, resources, and expertise to devote to protecting listed species. A good example is the flowering big-bracted dogwood, Benthamidia florida, which is critically endangered in Maine and Vermont solely because of its numerical rarity within the political boundaries of these states. However, the same species is considered widespread or abundant in Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and at the federal level because of the number of plants within these political jurisdictions. It almost feels a little bit like conservation gerrymandering. But plants do not care about jurisdictional boundaries. You can see this in how certain ecoregions are spread across state borders throughout New England on the slide. There was a clear need for increased communication and collaboration between the agencies and organizations addressing plant conservation at the local, state, and national levels. To address this need in 1990, Native Plant Trust and 68 public and private conservation organizations, including representatives from each New England state, launched the New England Plant Conservation Program, or NEPCOP. NEPCOP is a voluntary collaborative effort to preserve the diversity of New England's flora by preventing the extirpation of rare species by promoting their recovery in the wild. NEPCOP also helps craft and helps provide policy and direction for conservation activities with states and other conservation organizations, banks seed of rare plant species, schedules routine surveys, and creates management plans for populations of rare plants throughout the region. In each New England state, NEPCOP developed a task force of various stakeholders, including state botanists, government officials, and professional taxonomists, to coordinate and prioritize rare plant monitoring and seed collection. Each NEPCOP task force meets on an annual basis to discuss monitoring results, updates to the listing of plant species, and to prioritize species and populations for survey and seed collection in the upcoming year. However, before seed can be collected from a population, we need to first determine whether a population is still there and the size and health of the population. While the first NEPCOP meetings in the early 90s were focused on identifying and prioritizing species and sites for seed collection, it quickly became clear that the status of these rare plant populations needed to be determined first before seed collection could occur. The New England states had either just formed their natural heritage programs or were in the process of forming them and only employed 1 or 2 state botanists who were responsible for monitoring thousands of rare plant populations found within their state boundaries. Even with the help of NEPCOP task force members, there simply was not a sufficient number of surveyors to monitor all these populations with any form of regularity. In fact, many rare plant populations had not been visited since the late 1800s or early 1900s. It's hard to decide if we should collect seed or manage a population if we have no idea how big the population is or if the population still exists at all. Participating in these early task force meetings with NEPCOP was a conservation staff member, Francis Clark, who first had the idea that this problem might be solved through the creation of a citizen or community science monitoring program. This program would be focused on training amateur botanists, volunteers to monitor plants and provide data needed for NEPCOP to address whether a population was suitable for seed collection, needed additional monitoring, or should be prioritized for management or augmentation. Paul Summers, the state botanist with Massachusetts Natural Heritage at the time, was actually the first to agree to allow volunteers to monitor rare plant species and share rare plants data with our organization. Paul Summers worked with Francis Clark and Conservation Director Bill Brumbach to secure a grant from the Surdna Foundation to help develop this program and begin recruiting and training volunteers. In 1993, the Plant Conservation Volunteer Program was created and became the first in the United States to engage volunteers in helping state and professional botanists by monitoring and collecting data on rare plant species. The vision of the PCV program is to create a baseline of in situ monitoring data on New England rare plant species and populations with the goal of moving towards ex situ conservation with seed collections. The PCV program engages conservation-minded community members in activities that protect the integrity of New England's native flora, including monitoring rare plant populations to gather data on population size, health, phenology, as well as information about the surrounding plant community and site features. This is crucial data for determining rare plant population and species trends and changes to the New England landscape. Plant conservation volunteers also participate in collecting small samples of rare plant seed to be stored in Native Plant Trust seed bank. To capture the genetic diversity of a species in New England, we actually use distance as a proxy for genetic diversity, collecting seed from the most northern, southern, eastern, western, and central populations for our seed bank. We follow the strict guidelines of collecting no more than 10% of seed from no more than 10% of the plants present to make sure we do not impact the overall recruitment of the population. Collecting seed is necessary to preserve the genetic diversity of the population and to be used in research to better understand and conserve these species. Volunteers also assist in assessing present threats to rare plant populations, including development projects, natural forest succession, herbivory, invasive species, and recreational disturbance. On the slide is a photo taken by a PCV of a bike track going through a population of extremely rare silvery whitlow wort, Paronychia argyrocoma. By identifying and reporting threats to Native Plant Trust, natural heritage, and other conservations, these volunteers can help us to enact management actions to help address these threats and protect these rare plants. During their surveys, PCVs can also assist in the early detection of invasive species and report their presence to Native Plant Trust and natural heritage programs. We also invite PCVs to participate in invasive species management projects at locations where rare plant populations may be threatened. Our ecological programs coordinator, Bud Seckler, is responsible for coordinating management projects with state botanists and will invite PCVs to participate in management projects that require manual removal. Lastly, professional botanists will often invite plant conservation volunteers to participate in general botanical surveys of selected natural areas. This can serve as an amazing opportunity for volunteers to learn new plant species while assisting in incredibly important research and monitoring work. So shortly after its founding, the PCV program quickly grew and expanded into the remaining New England states. So in 1993, we started in Massachusetts with only 15 volunteers. In the first year of the 45 plant populations assigned for updating, the volunteers were able to locate 35 and provide updated population data. Better yet, the field reports were completed accurately, neatly, and in detail, often with photographs and hand-drawn maps of the populations. After seeing that our plant conservation volunteers could produce quality reports, other states began allowing our volunteers to monitor rare plant populations. Following Massachusetts, Vermont was the next New England state to join the program in 1996. Also, that same year, NEPCUP published the first edition of Flora Conservanda. This is a list of the plants of conservation concern, so rare, threatened, and endangered in each of the New England states, based on the data we had received from data shares with each state. Flora conservanda is unique in that it considers the global status of a rare species, its national status, and its status within each state. The taxa are evaluated in terms of the degree and type of threat they face, resulting in a regional priority ranking. Before the publication of Flora conservanda, the main task of the PCV program was to monitor known populations of rare plants based on priorities that were set by each state and not at a regional level. Flora conservanda helped give us a regional guide for what species to target without having to solely rely on the states. It actually became the point at which the PCV program was able to start incorporating ex situ conservation along with monitoring, because it helped us to prioritize which species and populations needed the greatest conservation. So in 1998, we expanded into New Hampshire, and in the following year, the PCV program started surveying in Rhode Island. That same year, in 1999, was also the year that we created our first database to house rare plant, landowner, and volunteer data called the NEPCOP Occurrence Record Manager, or NORM. Until this point, all of our records and data on each population were kept in a paper format and stored in numerous filing cabinets at our headquarters in Garden in the Woods. Ms. Karen Agee, the NEPCOP coordinator in the late 90s, saw the need for a centralized system to house species, volunteer, and owner information. She worked with Bill Brumback and Scott Fulton to design the NORM database. While NORM was initially intended only to hold information on surveyors and landowners, it was later adapted to hold information about rare plant populations and species. One fun fact about the NORM database is that instead of being copyrighted, the database is copylefted, with a note indicating that the database and its source code are to be freely distributed and used and modified by the conservation community to protect rare plants. So finally, in 2000, the plant conservation expanded to the remainder of New England with the additions of Connecticut and Maine. During the planning and creation of the PCV program, there was a lot of pushback against the idea, and many concerns were raised about having amateur botanists visiting rare plant populations and recording data. Would the information collected by volunteers be reliable? Would PCVs be able to accurately identify rare plant species and distinguish them from common lookalikes, or even rare species from other rare species? For example, the photos on the slide are of nodding bulrush, Scirpus pendulus at the top, and Long's bulrush, Scirpus longii at the bottom. While both are listed species, they are still commonly mistaken for each other and have similar stems and seed heads. A misidentification of a reported rare plant species by a volunteer will result in a false positive that will artificially increase the number of rare plants and may have consequences for its listing in conservation. False positives will also damage our relationships with the natural heritage programs and threaten the integrity of future enforcement of rare plant protection policies. Furthermore, how do we guarantee that our volunteers will maintain the confidentiality of these rare plant locations and ensure that the information is not leaked, which might increase these species' risk for poaching and trampling? The last major concern, and is something that I care very deeply about, is how we at Native Plant Trust can maintain the safety of our volunteers and make sure that they avoid trespassing and maintain good landowner relations. As the plant ecologist Frank Engler said, 90% of vegetation management is people management. To address these issues, Native Plant Trust created the Plant Conservation Volunteer Coordinator position to oversee the PCV program and ensure volunteer safety and data quality. This position was eventually retitled the Botanical Coordinator and is the position I hold today. In order to join the PCV program, all applicants are first screened by the Botanical Coordinator and then required to participate in a two-part training on how to properly conduct rare plant surveys and seed collections safely in the field. This training includes an online self-guided course and an in-person or virtual, in the case of a global pandemic, training session to cover program schedules, survey methodology, and data retrieval and submission processes. As part of the training, conservation staff also developed a handbook that incorporates the best monitoring practices and protocols for surveying and seed collection based on information from the Center for Plant Conservation and the Royal Botanic Gardens, as well as tips and instructions from Native Plant Trust staff and volunteers. A personal copy of this handbook is given to each PCV during the training to reference and review whenever they need. I just finished updating the 2022 version of the PCV handbook and is now roughly 250 pages long. In addition to completing the online training course and training session, all volunteers must sign a data security agreement promising to keep the information on rare plants and rare plant population locations confidential. We do not let our surveyors post any photos to Instagram or Twitter. Over time, the PCVs have shown themselves more than capable of collecting accurate and detailed data and maintaining the secrecy of rare plant locations. Many of these amateur botanists have gone on to become experts and joined the ranks of their state's NEPCOP task force and natural heritage program to help make important monitoring and management decisions. Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department's assistant botanist, Aaron Marcus, a former Native Plant Trust conservation intern and PCV, was quoted saying, "I can safely say that these volunteers collect some of the most detailed and high quality data because they have the time to gather that detail." Peter Bowman with New Hampshire's Natural Heritage Program said, "PCVs do the work we don't have the time or resources to do, so they are of great benefit. The data they bring in could prompt the decision to move a species' status from threatened to endangered, for example, so accurate documentation is crucial." PCVs are basically doing all of the data collecting to determine how these rare species are doing across New England, which in turn helps Native Plant Trust, the states, and the federal government make conservation decisions on which species need to be listed, delisted, or targeted for management, additional monitoring, or seed collection. Since the PCV program is centered around monitoring plants in spring and summer, our work follows a seasonal cycle. During the winter, Native Plant Trust staff select surveys based on a population's survey history, seed banking priority, flora conservanda ranking, and priority requests from the different state natural heritage programs. Survey lists are then generated and sent to each natural heritage program for review and comment, and then sent to the task force members as well for their feedback. During this time, the botanical coordinator organizes an annual outreach appeal to recruit new volunteers. This includes contacting roughly 1,400 garden clubs, conservation organizations, conservation commissions, and school programs throughout all of New England. In the following spring, training sessions are held throughout New England to teach volunteers about the program and how to conduct rare plant monitoring and seed collections. Once new volunteers have completed the training, they can then access the survey list and sign up for populations based on their interests. The botanical coordinator and conservation interns then work to secure permissions from federal, state, and municipal entities, nonprofit and private organizations, Native tribes, and private landowners. We want to do the hard part so the surveyors can actually do the fun part, which is getting out into the field and searching for these plants. Once permission is secured, we prepare survey assignment materials containing past information, maps showing where the plants were last observed, and a document outlining the survey actions and instructions on coordinating with the landowners. Our volunteers will spend roughly 2 to 4 hours reviewing assignment materials, coordinating with the other surveyors and landowners to then identify a date and time to conduct their survey. Site visits to survey a target population generally take anywhere from 4 to 8 hours. I have heard of a few volunteers who decide to take the long way to a population and have done 17-mile treks to go see rare plants, especially up in the mountains in New Hampshire and Vermont. But that is not the norm. Once PCVs have recorded their survey data, they generally will spend another 1 to 2 hours formalizing their notes, making maps, and getting their photos in order, and then submitting their data. Over the summer, all of the field form Native Plant Trust continues to secure permission and send out survey assignments to the volunteers who then conduct their rare plant survey trips. We also offer free field trips and webinars to thank PCVs for donating their time and effort to this program and provide educational opportunities. Then in the fall, all of the field forms have been submitted. Once all of the field forms are submitted, we review them and process them into our database and then share them with the state natural heritage programs. We also conduct volunteer appreciation events to thank the PCVs for their work, talk about how the season went, give the volunteers time to share what cool finds and stories they had from the field, and look at ways that we can improve our program for the next year. Since the creation of the PCV program, PCVs have made significant contributions to plant conservation. From the initial 15 volunteers, the number of PCVs have grown to roughly 350 active volunteers. We've trained well over 2,000 volunteers in the time that we've started since 1993. Each year, we offer anywhere from 1,200 to 2,000 populations for either survey or survey and seed collection. Often volunteers will sign up for about 1,000 to 1,200 of these surveys. We generally receive permission from landowners for about 4/5 or about 800 rare plant populations. And then at the end of the year, we usually receive about 600 completed rare plant reporting forms and roughly 120 seed collections. As of 2022, our volunteers have helped contribute roughly 15,000 rare plant observations and over 1,500 samples of rare plant seed. Through routine monitoring, we are often able to rediscover populations that have not been seen in 50 to 100 years. In 2012, a PCV named Harry Frost found slender bladderwort, Utricularia subulata, in Plymouth, Massachusetts, which had not been seen since 1927. This species is a short-lived carnivorous plant, and Massachusetts is actually at the northernmost edge of its range, where it's listed as a species of special concern. In 1999, PCV Deborah Levens discovered a new occurrence of large world pogonia, Isotria verticillata, in Derry, New Hampshire, where it had not been seen since 1909. This native orchid prefers dry mesic forests and can reproduce clonally and is extremely rare in New Hampshire. More recently, a population of bristly rose, Rosa aciculata subspecies Sei, was rediscovered in 2019 in Burlington, Vermont by Tom Norton. This population had not been seen at the location since 1907, over 112 years prior. The bristly rose is a small, sparsely branched, very bristly, as you can see from the picture on the right, a deciduous perennial shrub in the rose or Rosaceae family, and is critically endangered in the state. In 2000, another volunteer, Cindy Kalarks, used some tips from friends and relatives in her hometown of Groton, Massachusetts, and her knowledge of local habitats to find a population of climbing fern, Lygodium palmatum, which had not been seen since 1887. You can likely see how this fern earned the name palmatum, as the fronds kind of look like the palm of a hand. American climbing fern was the first plant actually protected by law in the US and is of special concern in Massachusetts. Being part of the PCV program also increases participants' familiarity and knowledge base of rare plants, so PCVs frequently identify new populations of critically imperiled plants on surveys and hikes. PCVs have helped find hundreds of new rare plant populations. The first year the program started in 1993, PCV Mary Lee Everett discovered a population of the regionally rare variable sedge, Carex polymorpha, in Massachusetts. This was an important discovery as there are probably fewer than 45 populations in the world, a third of which occur in New England. In Massachusetts, this species is listed as endangered. In 1998, Peter Lockwood discovered a new population of quill-leaved arrowhead, Sagittaria teres, in Rhode Island, where it is listed as extremely rare. The population Peter discovered is actually one of only 6 populations known in the state. Endemic to coastal plain ponds in the northeastern United States, the quill-leaved arrowhead occurs most abundantly on coastal plains in southeastern New England. In 2016, volunteers Barbara and Charlie Grunden discovered a new population of the federally listed small world pogonia, Isotria medialoides, in Maine. This species is globally rare, with most populations occurring in Maine and New Hampshire, where it typically grows in young open canopy forest and is disappearing due to forests undergoing succession and becoming older closed canopy forests. Warren King, a plant enthusiast at PCV since 2006, has studied the threatened eastern Jacob's ladder, Polemonium van Brugge, for over 15 years. While there are a couple of populations in Maine, most of the populations are found in a single county in Vermont. Throughout his years monitoring the plant, Warren has helped discover, describe, and monitor roughly 100 subpopulations of Polemonium. In 2018, Warren published his notes in the Status of Appalachian Jacob's Ladder in Vermont in Rodora, the Journal of the New England Botanical Society. Warren exemplifies how the PCV program tends to attract and retain passionate volunteers committed to conservation and the study of botany. While there are numerous species that are deemed historic or extirpated in New England, occasionally we are lucky enough to actually stumble across a new population. American chaffseed, Schwalbia americana, is an erect hemiparasitic perennial herb which secures its nutrients by tapping into the roots of neighboring host plants. While Schwalbia's range formerly covered much of the Atlantic and Gulf coastal plains of the United States from New England to Florida and West Texas, it is now extirpated throughout much of its historical range. There are roughly 20 populations left scattered in New Jersey, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. Schwalbia lives in early to mid-successional sand plains and requires disturbance to maintain that habitat. As more people settled in the region and disrupted the natural disturbance regime, vegetative succession slowly started pushing Schwalbia out of New England. The last New England population was seen at the Sconset Dump on Nantucket in 1965. Schwalbia was believed to be extirpated from New England until a PCV named Doug McGrady stumbled across a new population while searching for rare plants in 2018. News about the discovery made headlines and was even featured in the Boston Globe. In 2019, Native Plant Trust conservation staff took a trip with Doug McGrady, members of the Massachusetts Natural Heritage, and Schwalbia researchers from New Jersey to measure the extent of the population. After many hours of careful stem counting, we determined that the site had roughly 1,300 plants and well over 7,700 stems, making it one of the single biggest populations of American chaffseed left in the world. I will tell you from personal experience, you never know how big your feet are until you are trampling through a globally rare population that was once thought to be extinct in New England. During this visit, we also collected seed, which is being used in germination and propagation research by our research botanist, Dr. Jessamine Finch, to better understand the species and how we can work to better conserve it, potentially restore it throughout its natural range. Through their work, PCVs have also made important contributions to management. PCV Therese Thompson completed a special certificate project for Native Plant Trust, collecting historical and current records for New England blazing star, the Atrius nova Angliae in Massachusetts. Therese visited and transcribed data on the range of the New England blazing star from over 20 herbaria. She documented that the species, while once present in 53 towns in Massachusetts, was now only present in 14. Therese's documentation of the blazing star's decline led to the species being added to the Massachusetts rare plant list. PCVs also have been the first to detect if there's a legal collection of rare plants or destruction of habitat. A small but not atypical example of a PCV action that benefited a rare plant population comes from Colchester, Vermont, where PCV Heather Driscoll went out to monitor a population of a state-threatened species, golden Coreodalis ore, and discovered that some of the Coreodalis plants had been destroyed during the course of some driveway maintenance. Heather notified Bob Popp, a state botanist with Vermont Natural Heritage, and the two of them met with the landowner to encourage the future protection of the rare plants, as landowners frequently are unaware of the plant's existence. Being omnipresent and ready to act is often what it takes to safeguard many of the more vulnerable populations on our New England landscape. Because our volunteers make such important contributions to our conservation efforts, we do try and work hard to give back. Some of the benefits of being part of the PCV program include having the opportunities to visit some of the richest and most beautiful places in New England, many of which are privately owned and not accessible without permission granted by owners to Native Plant Trust. PCVs also have the opportunity to participate in educational training programs and classes that are offered free of charge. In years when we are not dealing with a global pandemic, field trips are scheduled for the PCVs, which are led by professional botanists to botanically interesting sites, which often include rare plant species. This way, volunteers can expand their knowledge of the interesting species and habitats in a fun communal setting. And at the end of the year, I mentioned earlier, we have PCV appreciation or wrap-ups as events with a potluck and review of the field season. This gives volunteers the space to share stories and photos from their field season, reflect on what could be improved, and catch up with other volunteers and friends. And the PCVs love the program. Massachusetts PCV Nancy Worthington has said of her time with the program, "I love to have an excuse to tromp places. We get sent to places that we would never have access to, a lot on private land. We do this because it's fun and because it's important work to do." Vermont PCV Kate Crucy, who is pictured on the right, who is now working with Vermont Natural Heritage, said, "Looking for rare plants is such an exciting thing to do. What will you find? It's the thrill of discovery." The success of the Plant Conservation Volunteer Program has become a model for other conservation organizations. The PCV program structure, database, and handbook have been shared with other organizations across the US, including the states of Washington, Georgia, Illinois, and Tennessee. Several farther-flung institutions have also emulated facets of the PCV program in their own community science projects, including Washington Rare Plant Care and Conservation at the University of Washington, Plants of Concern at Northwestern University, Bud Burst at the Chicago Botanic Garden, the Plant Conservation Program at the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum, and the North American Orchid Conservation Center at the Smithsonian. While the PCV program has been a success, there is still room to grow and problems to fix to continue improving and conserving more rare plant populations in the future. The biggest problem the program has been facing is how rare plant data is managed. Data gathered by the PCV program has mainly been held in 4 different systems. Survey data is entered into the NORM database, which, as you remember, was created to keep track of volunteers and landowner information, and then adapted to serve as our central location for information about each population. We use ArcGIS to store locational information for the rare plant populations we monitor and to prioritize which populations to collect seed from. While we use ArcGIS to help select populations for sampling, we have yet another database, IRIS-BG, where we store more detailed information on each seed sample we receive. Lastly, our interactive website, GoBotany, helps PCVs and the general public identify roughly 1,200 native New England plant species and holds taxonomic and distribution information on all of these species. And while these are the main 4, there were other data locations. Unfortunately, there's a lot of duplication in the data that is being entered into these systems. And there have been periods where new data has been entered into one of these systems and not updated in the other. Both NORM and the conservation website, which is used by our volunteers to access their survey and programmatic materials, are roughly 2 decades old and were badly in need of an update to increase data usability, efficiency, and user friendliness for volunteers. While NORM has served us well, it was not created with data utilization in mind. The past survey information in NORM was held in a text format, resulting in a giant paragraph for each population, where each sentence was associated with a different survey, usually. This makes it nearly impossible to look at trends across populations and species, which is key to helping to manage and protect these species from extirpation. On the slide is actually an example of a blank record of a single population in NORM. You can see that this system has become pretty convoluted and crowded, and some parts are actually no longer used. Lastly, there is also a serious lack of uniformity across states, which reduces our ability to share data. Each New England state has different requirements for what information should be collected, which can be a real headache for volunteers operating in multiple states. How data should be reported and how data needs to be formatted and stored. In the last decade or so, there have been many attempts to lay the groundwork for creating a new rare plant database and website. Unfortunately, because of the seasonal nature of our work, many of these efforts were usually paused and never picked back up again. The current conservation director, Michael Piantadosi, and I started the process again in the fall of 2019. But being botanists and conservationists, we really didn't have much experience with database design, and we're discovering that we were both truly out of our depths. Luckily for us, serendipity struck. Following one of our PCV wrap-ups, I received an email from George Koser, a volunteer in New Hampshire, who has been volunteering with our organization for over 20 years. George has extensive background in database design and management, and after hearing us describe the issues we were having with our current database and the need for a new system, George volunteered to work with us to design a new database, the Species Rare Occurrence Utility, or SPROUT. George's history with database creation and management and experience with over 2 decades as a PCV gives him a truly unique insight into this process and made him the perfect person for this job. Over the past 2 years, George has volunteered literally hundreds of hours working with conservation staff to understand our workflow and database needs to design the new Sprout database. This past May, we also started working with a company called Conda Software to take George's database and website schematics and create a new website that we are planning to put into production later this week or next week. In honor of George's contributions, he was actually given the Volunteer Service Award a couple of months ago. To continue advancing the capacity of the PCV program to conserve rare plants, the Sprout system is designed to make data from field forms and other field observations, past and future, more usable for Native Plant Trust staff, natural heritage programs, volunteers, and the conservation research community. Sprout will minimize data entry by hand and double data entry by Native Plant Trust staff by consolidating data housing locations and creating an online data submission portal. The system will improve data collection, review, and retention processes to help improve data quality. And lastly, we are working to accommodate future changes in technology and conservation, as who knows what the field is going to look like in another 10 to 20 years. While the process is not yet over, we have already made several important breakthroughs and successes during the creation of our new system. Through consolidating our data sources and completing total data shares with each natural heritage program, we have more than tripled the number of rare plant populations we're tracking from 7,000 to roughly 24,000. These populations will now be worked into our survey cycle and receive regular monitoring and protection. We are also working to better utilize the data that has been previously submitted by PCVs over the past 30 years. While creating the database, George has also worked to parse the data for each population that was currently trapped in the history section in NORM in the form of the giant unruly paragraph that you see on the slide. We have also started the process of transcribing past field forms into a spreadsheet to be uploaded into Sprout. Whenever we receive a field form, we save it as a Word or PDF document to a folder for that specific population. Currently, we estimate that we have roughly 12,000 field forms, which increases by roughly 500 to 600 each year. To be able to look at historical data, we wanted to capture all of the data in the past field forms, not just the superficial information summarized in the survey entries added to the history section in NORM. Unfortunately, because many of the field forms are handwritten or typed and scanned and have every possible answer under the sun, this process needed to be done by hand. George created a data entry form with roughly 32 separate fields to capture the information about each population, their surrounding natural community and environment, and potential threats. While we initially thought that this process would take several years, we have had amazing luck to have roughly half a dozen hardworking and dedicated database volunteers working on transcribing field forms. Together, they have spent hundreds of hours transcribing over 8,000 field forms to date that have all been uploaded into Sprout. We've in fact completed the transcription of all of the scanned field forms in Rhode Island, Connecticut, Vermont, and Maine, and are currently working through the remaining forms in New Hampshire and Massachusetts. The work of these volunteers have already paid dividends as this past year, our 2021 Atkinson Conservation intern, Allison Holmes, conducted the first research project to use transcribed data collected by our volunteers. Her project used phenology data from survey reports to determine how rare plant phenology was shifting over the past few decades. Allison found that many species are actually blooming earlier than previously recorded, a finding that will have important ramifications for our monitoring work, as well as the health of inland ecosystems. Another success of this process has been to create a standardized rare plant reporting form that can be used by volunteers in any state in New England. Every natural heritage program uses a different rare plant reporting form, and while there is some overlap, they still capture slightly different information. We compared the differences between each state's forms and selected the fields with the greatest overlap to create a new standardized New England rare plant reporting form. We then met with every state natural heritage program, and while we ran into some hurdles, miraculously, we were able to get all 6 states on board. Now, no matter where our surveyors are in New England, they can use a single form to record and report their data. Continuing to try and make the data entry process easier for volunteers and Native Plant Trust staff, we also created a web portal to submit their data for direct upload. Rather than recording the data in the field and then scanning or emailing their survey documents or physically mailing them to me, who will then spend weeks processing the data, volunteers can now upload their information into the form along with their maps and photos, click submit, and be done. Once submitted, the data will go into a housing area where it will be inspected for inconsistencies and then entered directly into the database where it can immediately be used for conservation research. The new Sprout system will enable us to expand the program and our survey capabilities at a critical time for rare plant conservation. It is important to remember that the entire program is currently run by 1 full-time staff person and 3 summer interns. By streamlining and simplifying this process, we will be able to attempt more surveys each year. By making the process by which surveyors sign up for surveys, access materials, and upload survey data and documents more straightforward and intuitive, we will also reduce barriers to entry for many volunteers and increase volunteer retention. Throughout this process, we now have records for thousands of more populations that will receive regular monitoring so we can better track species trends and detect threats earlier. We have also increased sharing and collaboration between states and will continue working towards a more regional conservation ethic. We want to expand this collaboration with the states and continue having semi-regular meetings with all natural heritage programs to discuss regional conservation topics and issues. By having a centralized system of parsed survey information, we will increase the research potential to help monitor population trends and assess research topics such as the impacts of climate change on phenology and species. Like most plant life on the planet, rare plant species in New England face the four horsemen of the ecological apocalypse: habitat destruction, overexploitation, climate change, and invasive species. Now Emeritus Conservation Director Bill Brumbach said of the future, "There's going to be fewer populations on the landscape through climate change or habitat destruction, so it is critical that we monitor these species to know when action is needed." Every year, the natural landscape in New England loses a valuable puzzle piece. It is a shrinking resource. If we are to be successful in maintaining the botanical diversity of New England's native flora, particularly in areas where the threats from population growth and development are fragmenting and disturbing the landscape, we need a well-trained and coordinated group of individuals to quickly spot problems and respond to them. The contributions made by the plant conservation volunteers over the past 29 years and future contributions will help conservation scientists and field botanists alike provide management and conservation decisions for these rare plant species to help them overcome these challenges. Running a regional rare plant monitoring program is a huge endeavor, and without the help of our volunteers, it would not exist the scale it does today. This only highlights the need and value our volunteers bring to the success of plant conservation in New England, and allows for more opportunities for our volunteers to participate in the future. With that said, we are always looking for new volunteers interested in protecting native plants and making a difference on the New England landscape. PCV Barbara Grunden says, "If you like botanical adventure, join the PCV program. This is a great way to meet new friends, explore a wide range of habitats while contributing to the knowledge of our flora." We are currently accepting applications for our 2022 field season. So if you're interested, please check out our website for a link to the application form. And with that, I would like to thank you all for listening to my presentation. I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have. And feel free to either unmute yourself or put any questions in the chat. And if there are no questions, I would just like to thank you for tuning in and listening to this presentation. I love working with these volunteers. My background is not actually in botany. I mastered in ecosystem science and conservation with a focus on GIS and community-based environmental management. But I'm just so passionate about conservation, and I get so excited working with these volunteers and learning about new plant species. The excitement and joy of knowledge is really infectious, and it's one of my favorite aspects of this job. So someone asked, what is the best way to deal with invasive species? That's a really good question. So it's hard. There are kind of different strategies based on what point in invading the plant is at. So the best way to deal with invasive species is to not let them establish in the first place. So one really good thing is constant monitoring. We actually work with the states to create an early detection list of species that we think is present in other states or might be a significant threat in the future. So we create those lists and help and distribute them to our volunteers to monitor them. Once they become established, it's really trying to manage them so they don't take over habitats, and then see if there's ways that we can adapt. There are some species that it really will be impossible to remove them from the landscape because they have become so pervasive that the only thing we can do is try and manage them in a way that will keep a kind of ecosystem balance. But if you have more questions about that, our ecological programs coordinator, Bud Steckler, is the person in charge of our management. Is there a required amount of time per month or season for each volunteer? There is not. We ask our volunteers to try and sign up or attempt at least one survey a year. So that's we usually ask our volunteers to sign up for maybe 3 to 4 surveys at a minimum, because since we are the ones securing permission, there are times where we don't hear back from landowners or are denied permission. So we usually ask them to try and attempt at least one a year. But if we don't get permission, we're not going to kick them out. So generally spread out over a few months. It's usually, I'd say, about 10 or 12 hours per survey. We have a wide range in our program. We have some people who will sign up for maybe 5 surveys, planning to do 2 or 3. We have some people who are retired who will do anywhere from 20 to 40 surveys a year.
Micah, I was wondering, you mentioned that you collect the seeds.
Yeah.
How do you store them, and then what happens to all the seeds that you've collected?
Sure. So we have a seed bank that's located at our Nasami facility in Western Mass. It's in Whately, Massachusetts. And we collect and clean and process the seeds into our seed bank there. In the past, they've mainly been used for longevity studies. So we'll take, after 5, 10, 20 years, we will take out a sample of seed and then see if we can germinate them. They've been used for germination research, propagation research. We are now trying to think of ways that we can better use those tests. So in the past, especially with germination trials, you will germinate the seeds, see what % of them are alive, and then discard them, really. Because of the kind of critical nature of these seeds, we're trying to work with the states to match up their needs for possible population augmentation with the tests that we're doing. So we're seeing if we can do germination trials and then grow these plant species out, if the states might have use for them for replanting the plants back in their original populations. If anyone has any more questions, you don't have to ask them now. Feel free to contact me. My email is mjasny, J-A-S-N as Nancy, Y, at nativeplanttrust.org. You can also look up our website, nativeplanttrust.org, which has more information about the PCV program. Maybe not as much as I went through tonight, but also has a link to the application form if you are interested and would like to join the program. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining me this evening.
Thank you, Micah.
Okay.
Thanks for the important work that you're doing.
Absolutely, and thank you for letting me share this opportunity.
Yeah, it was really interesting.
Okay.
Have a good evening, everybody.
All right, take care, everybody.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Livy.
Take care.
All right. Perfect. Thanks so much, Leanne. I hope you have
You're
a lovely
welcome.
evening, and I hope planning the summer camps goes well.
Thank you.
All right, take care.
Good night.